Ruth Calloway counted the coins twice because the first count had been wrong and the second count was worse. $18, 7 pennies. A brass button from Thomas's winter coat that she kept in the tin out of habit, because throwing it away had seemed, last fall, like throwing Thomas away. The morning light through the one window showed her what she already knew. The flour sack was down to a quarter. The salt pork was gone. The potato bin held 6 shriveled pieces that had sprouted gray tendrils in the heat. "Mama," Hannah said from the corner where she was playing with 2 corn husk dolls Ruth had made her in April, "can we have butter on the bread today?" Ruth did not answer. She slid the coins back into the tin, pressed the lid down with her thumb, and put the tin on the highest shelf where Samuel could not reach it and be tempted to feel rich. "Mama, no butter, sugar, but there's molasses." "Molasses isn't butter." "No," Ruth said, "it isn't." Samuel came in from hauling the morning water. 2 buckets from Mills Creek, 2 miles each way, which meant he had been walking since the grayness before dawn. His sandy hair was dark with sweat at the temples. He was 8 years old and carrying 4 gallons of water, and Ruth had stopped letting herself notice how his shoulders had begun to hunch. That was when the horse came up the rut. She knew the horse by its step. Ashworth sorrel, fat and sleek in a season when every other horse in 3 counties was showing ribs. The thud of it outside the door was the sound of a man who was not worried about tomorrow because he owned a portion of it. The knock was 3 short raps. Polite. Polite the way a wolf is polite to a lamb. "Mrs. Calloway," a word. Ruth opened the door. Cyrus Ashworth stood in a charcoal frock coat already beaded with dust along the hem, his gold watch chain catching the sun, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. His eyes moved over her kitchen in the half-second the door gave him, and she watched him count what she had. He came in without waiting, set the portfolio on the table, laid a fountain pen beside it. The pen was a silver Parker. Ruth had seen one once in the drawer of the station master's desk. They cost $8. Ashworth set his down on her pine table the way a gambler sets down aces. $30 for the whole 40 acres. I'll have the deed ready by Friday. You and the children can be east of the river by Sunday evening. My husband filed a homestead claim on this land, Mr. Ashworth. 2 years completed of 5, and then he died, Mrs. Calloway, which I was sorry to hear. A widow may complete her husband's claim under the statute, as you know. But completion requires improvements. It requires crops. His eyes went to the window, to the brown square that had been her garden in the spring. And it requires water. Hannah had drifted to the edge of the table. Ashworth looked down at her with the kind of smile a man uses on a child he is planning to starve. My offer closes in 3 days, ma'am. After that, I have other widows to visit. The county will take this for tax in October, and you'll get nothing at all. Ruth did not touch the pen. 3 days. 3 days, Mrs. Calloway. He rose, tipped his hat in the doorway. A sensible woman will have signed by supper tonight. She stood in the open door after he rode out and watched Thelma Pritchard's wagon come along the track. Thelma had sold her place 2 weeks back. Her wagon was piled. Her husband was not on it. Thelma reined up, squinting through the glare. You sign yet, Ruth? Not yet, Thelma. Sign, honey. There's nothing out here worth dying for. Not a stone, not a tree. Take his $30 and get those babies to your people before the cold comes and finds you empty. The wagon rolled on east. That night, Ruth sat by a single candle after the children were asleep. She had told herself she would sign in the morning. She had told herself 7 times and believed it none of them. She opened Grandmother May's leather notebook because she did not want to think, and the page it fell open to was a page she did not remember reading before. Where the biggest tree stands in dry country, there's water running where eyes can't see it. Don't you ever forget that, sugar. The tree is just the cup the earth drinks out of. Ruth lifted her head. Through the small window, silver under a 3/4 moon, she could see the oak. The oak that had stood on her hillside before Missouri was Missouri. 4-foot trunk, 120 feet of crown. Leaves still dark green in the worst drought any living soul could remember. She closed the notebook. She did not sign. The storm came down from the north. It began a little past midnight as heat lightning behind the ridge. Ruth watched it from the window while Samuel and Hannah slept. By 1 o'clock, the wind had turned. By 2, the oak on the hillside was bending in a way no oak that old had any business bending. At 2:15, a sound came that was not a sound so much as a feeling beneath her feet. A long, low groan like the earth itself remembering something it had tried to forget. Then a crash that rolled down the hill and under the cabin and stopped her breath. "Mama?" Hannah, waking, reaching. "We're all right," Ruth said. "Hush now, it's just weather." It was not just weather. She sat awake through the rest of the storm with Hannah in her lap and Samuel pressed against her side, and she did not let them see her shaking. Dawn came gray and clean and wet. She pulled her shawl over her nightdress and opened the door and walked out onto the hillside, bracing herself to find the shack collapsed, the root cellar caved in, the chicken coop in splinters. She did not find any of that. What she found was the oak. It lay on its side across the middle of her 40 acres, 120 feet of trunk that had stood since before the Louisiana Purchase, now stretched out long on the wet grass like something a child had knocked over and walked away from. Its crown was still green, but where the roots had been there was a vertical wall of earth 15 feet tall and 12 feet wide and 4 feet thick, a curb shelf of tangled dark brown roots holding packed Ozark soil, upturned to face her like the palm of a hand. And at its base, where the trunk had once anchored into the ground, there was a crater, 4 feet across, 3 feet deep, and water was coming up out of it. Clear water, cold water, water that tasted, when Ruth knelt and cupped it in her palm, of limestone and pine needles and something older than her grandmother's grandmother. She sat down in the wet grass beside the crater. She sat there a long time. The tree is just the cup the earth drinks out of. She was 10 years old. Grandmother May had her by the wrist. They were on a Tennessee hillside in July, and Grandmother May was pressing a forked willow switch into her hand. "The tree isn't hiding the water, baby. The tree is drinking it. Same as us. You learn to see what's feeding a thing that big, and you will never be thirsty again in this life." May's other hand, skin like brown paper over bone, had tapped Ruth's forehead. Most folks look at a tree and see a tree. You look at a tree and see a river they can't find. Ruth had been 10. Barefoot, the willow switch had dipped in her hand over a hollow beside a sycamore, and Grandmother May had said there, and they had dug, and there had been water at 6 feet. Ruth came back to herself on the wet hillside. She watched the spring bubbling into the crater. She watched it spill at the low lip and start to follow the natural gradient of the slope. "Mama?" Samuel in the door of the cabin, hair sticking up, squinting at the light. "Mama, the tree. I see it, baby." He came down the hill in bare feet, careful of the storm-broken branches, stood beside her, looked at the root wall, looked at the crater, looked at the root wall again. "Mama, it looks like a house with no front." Ruth put her hand on top of his head. "That's because the front hasn't been built yet." It was 9 in the morning before anyone rode past on the Ridge Road. Mr. Hollis, the Mills Creek storekeeper, out surveying storm damage. He reined up when he saw the fallen oak and made a clicking sound with his tongue that was meant to be sympathy. "Ruin, Mrs. Calloway, pure ruin. You should have taken Ashworth's offer yesterday, ma'am. He won't give you 30 now. With this mess to clear, Ruth stood in a way that put the crater behind her skirts. "I'll tell him when I see him." "That'll be tomorrow," Hollis said. "He's out collecting signatures all week." "You have a blessed day now, Mrs. Calloway, and my condolences on the tree." He clucked at his horse and rode on. Ruth waited until the sound of his hooves was gone from the ridge. Then she turned and looked at Samuel, and for the first time in 2 years she heard herself laugh. It was not a long laugh, but it was enough to surprise the boy, who had been bracing himself to see her cry. "Go wake your sister. We've got work to do today." Cyrus Ashworth arrived the next morning a full hour earlier than he had the day before. The portfolio was the same. The pen was the same. His horse had been groomed. Ruth met him at the door with her hair combed and Hannah on her hip. $30 stands, Mrs. Calloway. I can have this drawn up by supper. I need 30 days, Mr. Ashworth. He took a breath, the way a man takes a breath before explaining something simple to a slow child. 30 days changes nothing, ma'am. This drought won't break before October. Your children will be thinner. Your co-op will be empty. And my price drops to 25 on the 1st of September. I'm offering 30 as a kindness today. 30 days. Mrs. Calloway. He looked past her, through the door, out to the hillside. You haven't even cleared this mess. You think you can make a crop on a lot that has 120 feet of timber lying across it? 30 days, Mr. Ashworth. He studied her. He decided that 30 days of a widow alone on a ruined claim would bring her back to this door more desperate than she already was. He almost smiled. He nodded once. 30 days, 1st of September, Mrs. Calloway. Not 1 hour more. The horse had not finished turning on the track before Ruth was on her knees on the floor with Grandmother May's notebook open across her lap and Samuel and Hannah crouched beside her like conspirators. "Look here, both of you look." The notebook was 40 years old. The leather of the cover was cracked at the spine. Grandmother May had written in it in 2 hands, her young hand, round and careful, and her old hand, slanted and spare. The page Ruth turned to was from the old hand. Ozark Springs run strongest after a disturbance storm. Uprooting. Earth shake. The ground remembers its own water and tells the truth once it is opened. 3 weeks for the flow to settle. Then it runs for as long as the limestone holds it, which is as long as forever that matters. "What's a disturbance?" Samuel asked. "A storm, like the one 2 nights ago. And a spring is a place where the water comes up out of the ground by itself, without a well." Samuel's eyes went wide. Hannah's eyes followed his because Hannah was 5 and Samuel was 8, and anything her brother thought was important became immediately important to her also. Ruth turned the page. Her hands were not steady. She pressed her palm flat on the paper and spoke to them both. "This is going to take us 30 days, maybe 28. We are not going to tell anyone what we are doing. Not the Pritchards, not Mr. Hollis, not the Reverend, not a living soul until Mr. Ashworth rides up that track on the 1st of September and finds us here." "Why not tell?" Hannah asked. "Because if people know, Mr. Ashworth will know. And if Mr. Ashworth knows, he'll find a way to stop us. But if we look like nothing is happening, if we look like a widow and 2 children waiting to lose their home, he'll leave us alone until the day we're ready." She laid out the plan. The cabin would go inside the root cavity. The upturned root ball itself, 15 feet of packed, root-bound earth, would be the back wall. They would build a 14 by 10-foot room using oak planks hand-sawn from the fallen trunk. A door facing south. A single small window. A roof of cedar shakes split from the smaller limbs. Total interior floor area, 140 square feet. The spring would go second. A stone basin bombsea, flat limestone stones from the hillside, laid in concentric circles, 3 feet in diameter, a foot deep. lined at the bottom with fine gravel to let the water rise and keep the silt from clouding it. Then the channel. 80 feet of hand-dug ditch running down the natural slope from the basin to a flat patch of hillside where the ground fell 8 feet over that distance, a 10% gradient. Plenty for gravity flow. 2 feet wide, 6 inches deep. Lined with more flat stones to prevent erosion. Last the garden, 30 feet by 40. Corn at the north end where the water would enter. Beans and squash along the middle. Tomatoes and peppers at the southern end where the sun was strongest. Samuel, he straightened, your job is cutting and stone hauling. You are going to work harder than you have ever worked. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. Hannah, the little girl nodded solemnly. You are going to sort seed and carry the small stones and bring me water when my arms are full. You are our foreman. Do you know what a foreman is? No. A foreman is the person who keeps the grown-ups honest. Hannah thought about this, then she nodded. Ruth closed the notebook. She pressed her palm on the cover the way Grandmother May used to press her palm on Ruth's forehead to check for fever. We start at first light. The first 10 days reduce them to salt, sinew, and stubbornness. Day 3. Ruth cleared the root cavity of loose earth by hand, crouching inside the hollow the upturned roots had left, shoveling clumps of clay and small stones into a flour sack and dragging the sack out and emptying it downhill. She filled the sack 41 times. By sundown, her shoulders had gone numb and her hands had opened in 3 places. Samuel brought her water and Hannah brought her a piece of cornbread, and neither of them asked her to stop. Day 4, they framed the walls. Ruth cut 14 oak posts from the fallen trunk's smaller limbs using the long-handled handsaw that had been Thomas's. Each post was 8 feet tall and 4 inches across. Samuel held each one steady while she sank its base into the earthen floor and packed stones around the heel. The boy had to stand on a flour sack stool to reach the top of the taller posts. When they finished, she sat on the ground and could not get up for 10 minutes, and Samuel sat beside her and did not speak. And she was grateful to her son for understanding that some silences are not empty. Day 5 was stone hauling, and stone hauling would go on for 3 days. Mama, why can't we just ask the church? Samuel asked it on the morning of day 6, sitting on a flat limestone slab too heavy for him to lift alone, wiping his face with the back of his wrist. His hair was matted with dust. There was a scrape on his cheek from a stone that had clipped him the day before. He looked suddenly older than 8. Ruth set down the stone she had been rolling and sat beside him. The church already gave us a blanket, sugar. A blanket. A blanket and some canned peaches, yes. After your papa's funeral, and a hymn, and a promise they'd be praying for us. And then the Reverend went home and had his supper. So they won't help? They already helped in the way they know how. And the Reverend is a good man. But there's a kind of help that's a blanket, and there's a kind of help that's 30 days of work. And churches are mostly built for the first kind. She touched the back of his hand. We are asking your grandmother's God today. The one who told her to work her way through the Tennessee drought of 42 and not look back. That's a harder God. Ruth laughed. It was a thin laugh, but a real one. That's a harder God, baby. Yes. They carried 127 stones in the end. The smallest was 2 pounds. The largest, the one Samuel and Ruth carried together on a stretcher made from a horse blanket and 2 oak poles, was 15. They laid them in a pile beside the crater. On day 7, Ruth began setting the first course of the spring basin. Flat stones placed in a ring 3 feet across. Each stone fitted to its neighbor without mortar because Grandmother May's notebook had said never dam a spring, cradle it. Day 8, they began the channel. Ruth cut the earth with the spade. Samuel followed behind with a wooden scoop Thomas had made for winnowing and lifted the loosened soil out of the cut. Hannah walked the line with a string and 2 pegs to make sure they were not wandering. The 5-year-old took the job seriously. She corrected her mother twice. Day 9, Ruth sawed oak planks from the down trunk. 14 planks, each 7 feet long, 5 inches wide, 1.25 inches thick. The handsaw dulled twice. She sharpened it with a file her grandfather had given Thomas at their wedding, and when she sat cross-legged in the dirt drawing the file along the teeth, she realized she had not cried once in 9 days, and that this was not because she had stopped missing Thomas, but because the missing had begun to pull instead of push. That night, after the children were asleep, Ruth sat alone beside a single candle and opened Grandmother May's notebook to the back page, the blank page, and wrote, "Mama, I do not know if this will hold. I am doing what you told me. If it does not hold, I need you to know I tried. Forgive me for not being enough." She closed the notebook. She put her head down on her arms beside it. She slept until Hannah padded out of the bedroom and put her small warm hand on the back of her mother's neck and said, "Mama, your candle's gone out." And Ruth sat up and remembered why she was still awake on the 9th day of 30 and kept going. The basin held on day 12. Ruth removed the diverter stone a little after 10 in the morning with both children watching. Water rose through the fine gravel bed in 30 seconds. It found the level of the lip. It found the overflow notch. It began to run, clear, cold, without hesitation, down the stone-lined channel toward the garden. She had Thomas's pocket watch in her apron and a cedar bucket at the channel's end, and she timed the flow for 15 minutes, 3.25 gallons in that window. 3 gallons a minute. 3 gallons a minute for as long as the limestone held it, which was as long as forever that mattered. Samuel whooped. Hannah ran both hands into the flow and then put her wet hands on her mother's face. "Mama, it's cold. 54 degrees, sugar, year-round. Ozark Springs run at the temperature of the stone they rose through. That's colder than our house. That's colder than anything you've touched in a month." Day 14, the green began. Hannah found it first, running back up the hillside with her cheeks flushed, shouting before she was in earshot, "Mama, Mama, the dead grass is coming back." Ruth walked down. A thin, hesitant line of green had stitched itself along both sides of the channel, 4 feet wide, give or take, where the moisture had wicked laterally into soil that had been brown for 6 weeks. Inside that 4-foot band, the dormant prairie grass had decided it was April again. It was arithmetic, capillary action in loamy Ozark soil. Grandmother May had written, pulls moisture 3 to 6 feet out from a constant water source. This was arithmetic, but arithmetic, Ruth thought, watching Hannah chase a grasshopper that had no business still being alive, is also its own kind of miracle when it comes out right. Day 15. A rider appeared on the ridge road at the boundary of the property. Not Ashworth. A younger man, thick in the shoulders, hat pulled low. Ashworth's foreman, Bram Coulter. Coulter rode the boundary slow. From the ridge road, the fallen oak looked like what it had looked like to Mr. Hollis a week earlier. 120 feet of ruin. The cabin door faced south into the cavity, which meant it was invisible from the road. The channel ran down the north-facing slope and could not be seen from above without walking down the hill. The green line beside the channel was 4 feet wide in a landscape where brown went to the horizon, but it was below the ridge line and out of Coulter's field of view. Coulter sat his horse a long time. Then he turned and rode back east at an unhurried trot. Ruth and the children did not move from the cavity until the sound was gone. That evening Hannah stood in the channel in her bare feet while Ruth finished the last of the cedar shake roofing. The girl sang, softly, a Tennessee hymn Grandmother May had taught Ruth when Ruth was her age. Ruth listened to it with a handful of shakes in one hand and a hammer in the other, and she realized she had not heard Hannah sing since Thomas had died. She did not interrupt. She drove 2 more shakes. The song went on. Day 16, they slept in the cabin for the first time. Ruth lit the small iron stove. The pipe went straight up through the roof. The chimney draw was excellent. The cold mass of the root earth wall behind the cabin pulled the smoke up fast and out. Interior temperature at sunset was 68. Exterior was 94. Samuel put his hand on the root wall and announced that it felt like a cool hand. Hannah said it smelled like earth and wet rope. Samuel said it smelled like home. Hannah said home was where there was butter, and this was where there was wet rope. Samuel said she was a goose. Ruth listened to them bicker, lying on her back on the straw tick mattress she had dragged into the cabin that afternoon, and she thought, this is the first time in 2 years I have heard my children argue like children. Not scared, not hungry. Only disagreeing about whether a house smelled like wet rope. Mama, isn't it? Your sister is right. It does smell a little like rope, but it is still home. See. Fine. Ruth smiled at the ceiling in the dark. That was day 16. Day 18, Ruth woke before dawn and knew something was wrong. She did not know how she knew. She lay in the dark for half a minute listening. She heard the children's breathing. She did not hear the spring. She got up quickly and went outside with the lantern. The channel was nearly dry. A thin thread of water, no more than the width of her palm, wound down the stone and disappeared. The basin had dropped 2 inches below the rim. She knelt and measured with the pocket watch and the bucket. 1 1/5 gallons a minute. Less than half of what it had been on day 12. Mama? Samuel, in the doorway of the cabin in his nightshirt. Hannah wrapped around his leg because where Samuel went, Hannah was already going. Go back to bed, sugar. What's wrong with the water? I don't know yet. He came down the hill in his bare feet, which was a mistake because the stones around the basin were still slick with overnight dew. He reached to brace himself on the wall of the basin and dislodged a flat stone at the rim. The stone did not fall far. It fell 6 inches. It fell directly onto his left forearm. Samuel did not cry. He made a small sound like a dog that had been stepped on. Hannah screamed, which was how Ruth knew how bad it was. Hannah was 5, and she had been trained by drought and grief not to scream. Ruth was across the stones in 2 strides. She lifted the fallen rock off the arm. The skin had split in a 2-inch line. The bone, she pressed carefully with her thumb, was cracked but not broken through. A bruise was already rising under the skin like a storm coming in from the south. Sit still, baby, don't move. Hannah, go into the cabin and get my sewing basket. Go now. She carried Samuel up the hill herself, laid him on the straw mattress, cleaned the split skin with spring water, which even in her panic she recognized as a small grace. The water ran at 54 degrees and it stopped the swelling before it started. She tore a strip 4 inches wide from the hem of her petticoat, split a flat piece of cedar shake for a splint, wrapped the arm from elbow to wrist. Samuel's jaw was set hard the whole time. He did not weep until she was done, and then he wept quietly into her neck, and Ruth rocked him and said, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I am so sorry, until he fell asleep. It was noon before she got back to the basin. She opened Grandmother May's notebook and read 3 entries on springs, and none of them said anything about flow dropping after 12 days. She wrote on the blank page at the back, Mama, I am going to fail him. Then she made herself think. The storm had disturbed the ground. The tree had come up. That had opened the spring. Fine, but the storm had also churned soil into every underground channel the spring ran through. The initial burst of water had been the storm-cleaned rush. As the system had begun to settle, the silt was finding the narrower passages and beginning to clog them. The fix was in the notebook, after all, just not where Ruth had looked for it. 2 pages back, under for a well-gone muddy, May had written, Lay a bed of pebble the width of a baby's fist at the inlet, and the silt will catch there, and the water will learn to find its way through as through a sieve. Fine gravel, a filter, not at the surface, but at the inlet. The place where the water actually came up out of the earth, beneath the basin. Ruth spent day 19 emptying the basin. She lifted every flat stone, bucketed out the water, and by late afternoon found what she was looking for, a spot 4 inches below the original earth where the water was bubbling up through a visible funnel of silted clay. She reached her arm down past her elbow, cleared the silt with her fingers, packed a 6-inch bed of pea-sized river gravel she had carried up from Mills Creek on day 17 for another purpose entirely, reset the basin stones over the new gravel bed. By sundown day 20, the flow was back, 3 1/5. By day 23, it had stabilized at 3.5 gallons a minute, stronger than it had ever been, because the silted passages were now permanently armored against collapse. Day 24, Hannah filled a tin cup at the channel and brought it up the hill and held it out to Ruth, who was sitting in the open cabin door with Samuel asleep against her shoulder. "Papa would be proud, Mama." Ruth took the cup. She drank half of it. She set it down on the threshold. She put her face into her free hand and cried for 10 full minutes without making a sound. Then she stood up, laid Samuel down on the straw, kissed the top of Hannah's head, and went back down to finish the last 12 feet of channel. Day 25, Coulter rode the ridge again, but this time on the south leg, not the north. And from the south, he could see down the slope. And from the south, he could see the channel. And from the south, he could see the 4-foot-wide line of green stitching its way through 40 acres of brown. He stared for half a minute, turned the horse, rode hard for Mills Creek. The drought reached its 87th day on the morning Cyrus Ashworth filed his petition in Mills Creek. He walked into the county clerk's office in a coat that was no longer clean at the hem because there was no water to launder it with, and he filed 3 documents. A notice of challenge to Ruth Calloway's late husband's homestead claim, a water rights protest alleging that her alleged spring was in fact diverted groundwater from his own property 2 miles east, a demand for emergency hearing before Judge Elias Whitmore. The hearing was set for 3 days out. Ashworth walked from the clerk's office to the storefront steps of Hollis Mercantile and held court. A half-dozen men had drifted into town looking for news of any water being brought in by rail, and Ashworth addressed them loudly enough to be heard in the street. The story is, gentlemen, that a widow on a 40-acre rock pile has discovered a spring under a fallen tree. Water enough to keep a garden green. Water enough, we are told, to sell. This is the story. You will hear it at your kitchen tables tonight. Now let me tell you what I am asking Judge Whitmore to hear on Thursday. He spread his hands. I am asking him to consider whether a widow and a crater are the kind of witnesses the state of Missouri intends to build water policy on, or whether perhaps a woman with 2 small children and no husband might be mistaken about what she is seeing. These are the stories the ignorant tell when they are too proud to accept a fair offer. Thursday morning, Judge Whitmore rode to Ruth's property with the county surveyor, the clerk, and, riding stiffly behind, Cyrus Ashworth. Ruth met them in her Sunday dress. Samuel, arms still in the cedar splint, stood beside her. Anna held a tin cup full of cold spring water and offered it first to Judge Whitmore, who had known Thomas Calloway in life and who took the cup with both hands. Mrs. Calloway. Judge Whitmore. May I see the spring, ma'am? She walked him down. The surveyor brought a measuring chain and a brass level. Whitmore walked the length of the channel and crouched beside the garden. 30 feet by 40. Corn was 8 feet high and filling. Beans twined up the corn stalks. Squash ran along the rows. At the southern end, a bed of tomatoes the size of a man's fist was beginning to ripen. Whitmore looked at the garden. looked at the channel, looked at the stone basin and the crater of the spring, looked at the fallen oak, looked last at Ruth. "Ma'am, have you kept any record of your use of this water?" She brought out a bound oilcloth book. Daily entries since day 12. Flow in gallons per minute. Channel depth. Garden yield by week. The handwriting steadied from trembling on day 12 to neat on day 20, and then almost proud by day 40. Whitmore read for 15 minutes. The surveyor measured the channel gradient. The clerk recorded. Ashworth stood a little apart, jaw set, watching. Mr. Ashworth. Whitmore closed the log. Your petition claims this spring diverts groundwater from your property 2 miles east. That is correct, Your Honor. The county surveyor has measured the elevation of your well against the elevation of this spring. Your well is 47 feet higher than this spring and lies 2 miles on the other side of a limestone ridge. Groundwater does not, as you know, flow uphill. Silence. Further, Mrs. Calloway has made visible, continuous, beneficial use of this water for 43 days. The Homestead Act statute provides that a widow may complete her husband's claim by continuing the required improvements. Mrs. Calloway has done so. This water is hers. This land is hers. He handed the oilcloth log back. Your petition is denied, Mr. Ashworth. Your protest is dismissed. The claim stands. Good day to you. Whitmore tipped his hat to Ruth. Mrs. Calloway, I am very sorry about Thomas. He was a good man. You are a good woman. I am pleased to have been useful to you today. He rode back to Mills Creek. Ashworth did not ride back. He stood on Ruth's hillside another full minute, looking at the channel, looking at the garden. His mouth moved as if he meant to say something, and then he did not. He mounted his horse. The horse stepped sideways, hungry, thirsty, not cared for at the standard of a man like Cyrus Ashworth. Ashworth corrected it with the reins harder than necessary. He rode away east. He did not go home. He went to the farm he had been holding 3 miles east, where his wife Eleanor and their 3-month-old son had been living with 40 head of cattle. His foreman Coulter met him at the gate with news. The cattle had stopped drinking the Sour Creek water. 17 had lain down in the pasture that morning. 9 had not got up. Eleanor was weeping on the porch with the baby in her arms. The baby's face was red. Its small mouth was dry. It had not passed water since sunrise. Ashworth went into his own kitchen, and he sat at his own table, and he put his head in his hands. He came at dusk. He walked, because the sorrel had not been able to carry a grown man 2 miles since morning. He walked beside Eleanor on the buggy seat because the buggy horse could still pull an empty trap, but not a heavy man in it. And Eleanor was holding their son, and the son was breathing shallow and fast, and had not made any sound for an hour. Ruth saw them on the track from the cabin door. Samuel saw them a moment later and stood up. "That's him, Mama. I see him, sugar. Don't you open that door." Ruth looked at her son. "Mama, he tried to take our home. He called you ignorant in front of everyone in the county. I was there. I heard. Don't you open that door for him." Hannah came and stood between them, 5 years old, tin cup already in her hand, because she was the one who carried water in this house, and she had understood before either of them what was happening. "But Mama," Hannah said, and her voice was small, "Mrs. Ashworth is crying, and the baby is hot." Ruth stood in the door a long second. She was thinking of Thomas. Thomas would have given water to anyone. She was thinking of Grandmother May, who had said, in a Tennessee kitchen, when Ruth was 11 and a man who had treated them badly had come begging bread, "Show them who you are, sugar, not who they made you." She was thinking of Samuel's arm, still in its splint, and of Hannah's tin cup, and of the 87 days of drought, and of the $30 offer in July, and of the pen on the table. She walked down the hill to meet them at the edge of the property. Ashworth's face was gray. There was a day of beard on his jaw. His coat was open at the collar and his throat was sunburned and rashed. When he saw her, he stopped walking. He put out a hand to the side of the buggy to steady himself. "Mrs. Calloway, I am asking. $5 a bucket. I don't care what you... I don't care. $5 a bucket. For my boy, for Eleanor. You can set any price you wish. I will pay it." Eleanor on the buggy said, "God help us." Ruth, God help us. Ruth walked past Ashworth without answering him. She went to the channel. She dipped the cedar bucket in. She carried it up to the buggy and she passed it up to Eleanor and she said, "Wet a cloth and lay it on his face first, not his mouth. Small sips after. His body will take the water faster if the skin learns it is coming." Eleanor took the bucket with both hands and began to weep so hard she could not hold it. Ruth steadied it for her. Ruth tore a strip from her own apron. The apron she had been wearing on the July morning Ashworth had put the pen on her table, and she wet the strip and she laid it herself over the baby's forehead. The baby, after a long minute, opened its eyes. Ruth stepped back from the buggy, turned to Ashworth. 10 cents a bucket, Mr. Ashworth. Same as everyone else who has come to this hillside in the last 3 weeks pays. Same price to the widow Heenan, who lost her husband in the spring. Same price to the Reverend Loomis, who needed water for his wife's garden. Same price to you." She met his eyes. "You do not owe me $5. I would not take a 10 cents today. Next week, every week for as long as the drought lasts. Take as many buckets home tonight as your buggy will carry." Ashworth stared at her. I do not have 10 cents with me today, Mrs. Calloway. I rode without my wallet. Then pay me Friday." "Mrs. Calloway, take the buckets. Go home, Mr. Ashworth. Your wife needs to lay that child down somewhere cool before the sun finishes going down." He nodded. He could not speak. He took 2 buckets to the buggy himself and 2 more with him when he walked back beside Eleanor. He did not look at Ruth again until he was at the track. Then he turned once, and he did not tip his hat. He had no hat on, and he bowed his head. It was the first thing Ruth had ever seen Cyrus Ashworth do that was honest. Ruth went back up the hill. Samuel was standing at the door of the cabin. "Mama, why did you help him?" She sat down on the cabin threshold and pulled him into her lap, splint and all, and she looked out at the oak and the channel and the green line of grass where the water ran to the garden. "Because we're not the people he thought we were, Samuel, and I will not let him make us into them." Is that what Grandmother May meant? That is what Grandmother May meant. Hannah came and leaned against her other side. The 3 of them sat in the doorway a long time watching the last light leave the hillside, and after a while Hannah said, "Mama." "Yes, sugar." "Mrs. Ashworth says God help us. Will God help them?" Ruth put her cheek on the top of Hannah's head. "God already did, baby. He sent a storm in July. The first rain came on the 11th of October. It fell on a Sunday afternoon, and it fell for 11 hours, and when it stopped, the drought had broken on its 104th day. Ruth and Samuel and Hannah stood in the cabin door with the door open and watched the water pooling in the cracked earth beyond the green zone and wetting the bones of the grass everyone had thought was dead. The spring kept running 3.5 gallons a minute, indifferent to the weather, as springs mostly are. By December, Ruth had $127 in the tin on the high shelf. 10 cents a bucket had added up the way arithmetic does. Ashworth himself had paid $3.40 by the end of September, carrying the money up the track himself and laying it on the cabin threshold and walking back down without a word. Ruth had counted it that night and marked it in the oilcloth log the same way she marked every other customer, and she had not mentioned it to the children because there was nothing to mention. In January, Ruth rode the stage to Jefferson City with Thomas's homestead paperwork and Grandmother May's notebook in a flour sack on her lap and Samuel's hand in hers. The clerk at the land office read the file, read the oilcloth log, and signed the patent on the spot. 40 acres, Ruth Calloway. Her name, her signature. The clerk let Samuel press the county seal onto the hot wax himself, which was a small thing and which Samuel would remember for 70 years. In the spring after the drought, 7 of Ruth's neighbors repurchased farms that Ashworth had bought cheap the previous summer. Ruth lent each of them the down payment from her water money, at the same plain interest the First Bank of Mills Creek would have charged, and none of them were ever late. Ashworth did not lose his farm in the first year. His speculation business collapsed in the second year after the drought from too many loans and too little land sold, and he and Eleanor moved to St. Louis. He sent Ruth a letter the Christmas after the move. It was 3 lines. Mrs. Calloway, our son is 4 and well. My wife sends her regards. I am not the man I was that July, and I owe you the life of my child. Cyrus Ashworth. Ruth put the letter in the front of Grandmother May's notebook, and she never showed it to a living soul, but she read it twice a year for the rest of her life. The spring kept running. In the 5th year, after the drought, Ruth stood at the Mills Creek Grange on a February evening and was asked to say a few words about her hillside. She had not expected to be asked. She wore a new wool dress and Hannah had braided her hair, and she had not prepared a speech. She said, "The biggest tree in a dry land is drinking from somewhere deep. That is what my grandmother taught me in Tennessee when I was a little girl. The tree is not the problem. The tree is the map. Look for the tallest, the oldest, the greenest tree on a hillside where nothing else grows, and I can promise you that tree has its roots in water you cannot see. And what that tree is drinking, you can drink too, if you know how to ask the land." She paused. And the second thing I would say is this. What people call worthless is often only hidden. You do not always have to build a thing. Sometimes you have to uncover it. Sometimes the ground will open itself to you, and all that you are asked to do is have the wit to notice. The Mills Creek Grange printed both sentences in the newsletter that spring. By the autumn, the sentences had traveled to the granges of 4 adjoining counties. By the 10th year after the drought, men Ruth had never met in Arkansas and in Kentucky were quoting them as old country wisdom, and Ruth, when she heard this, did not correct anyone. Samuel was 13 in the year of the Grange talk. By the time he was 18, he was teaching younger farmers how to read a hillside for water. Hannah was 15 the year she became engaged to Thomas Kincaid from the neighboring hollow, and the 2 of them built their first cabin on the adjoining slope on exactly the pattern of Ruth's, the upturned root ball of a storm-felled elm providing the back wall, a small spring in the crater, a channel running down to their garden. Hannah's oldest daughter, when she was born, was called May. Ruth never remarried. She did not want to. Thomas had been her husband, and Grandmother May had been her grandmother, and her children were her children, and the oak on the hillside was her oak. The cabin inside the root cavity stood for as long as Ruth did, which was another 41 years. Moss grew on the root wall, and ferns grew out of the root wall, and by the end, the wall was indistinguishable from the hillside it had come out of. When Ruth was an old woman, she went to market in Mills Creek one September morning, and a young farmer at the feed store said to his neighbor in her hearing, "My daddy says the biggest tree in a dry land is drinking from somewhere deep." The young man did not know who she was. "Where did your daddy learn that, son?" "Old country saying, ma'am." "My daddy's daddy used to say it." Ruth paid for her flour. She smiled at the young man. She walked out into the bright afternoon, and she crossed the square, and she went home to her hillside and to the oak and to the spring, which was still running at 3.5 gallons a minute, and she sat down on the threshold of the cabin, and she wrote one more entry on the last blank page of Grandmother May's notebook. A grandmother in Tennessee, a tree in a storm, and a daughter who finally learned to read what was already there. The end.